There is something underneath America that the government has never fully explained. Something carved out of granite and bedrock by human hands, by machines the size of apartment buildings, deep below the surface of the land you walk on every day. Something that has been growing quietly and systematically since the first atomic bomb changed the nature of war forever. You have felt it, maybe, without knowing what you were feeling. That particular unease when you stand on ground that feels too solid, too permanent, and you wonder, what is beneath this? Not dirt, not rock, something else. Rooms, tunnels, entire cities running on generators and filtered air, stocked with food and water enough to last a decade. Staffed by people whose names do not appear on any public record. Funded by budget lines so deeply classified that Congress itself has only the broadest outline of what they authorize. This is not science fiction. This is not the fevered territory of late-night radio and online forums populated by people who see patterns in vapor trails. What lies beneath the surface of the United States, documented, confirmed, and in many cases openly acknowledged by the Pentagon, represents one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in human history. An underground empire built not in decades, but in years, driven by a single overwhelming fear that reshaped the entire architecture of American military strategy. The fear of the bomb. And what was built in response to that fear, what continues to be built right now, as you read this, goes deeper than most Americans have ever been told. Deeper in the literal sense of hundreds of meters of solid rock between you and the nearest classified installation. Deeper in the sense of ambition, of engineering, of the sheer scale of what was attempted and achieved. And deeper, perhaps, in implication, in what the existence of these places tells you about how your government understands the world, about what it is preparing for, and about what it believes may one day come. The story begins with a sound. In communities scattered across the American Southwest, the Rocky Mountains, and the Appalachian Range, residents have reported for decades a low, persistent throbbing that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind of sound that registers at the edge of perception, felt more than heard. A vibration that sets windows trembling slightly in their frames, that disturbs sleep without quite waking the sleeper. Local residents call it the hum. Investigators have traced it, mapped it, analyzed it with sensitive equipment, and found themselves unable to fully account for its source. One hypothesis is natural. Some of the frequencies recorded in these areas are consistent with microseismic activity, with ocean wave interactions, with the behavior of standing acoustic waves in geological formations. This is plausible. The Earth generates sounds of its own that human infrastructure sometimes amplifies. The other hypothesis is not natural at all. Tunnel boring machines, the extraordinary devices that make modern underground construction possible, produce a distinctive rhythmic vibration as their rotating cutter heads chew through rock. The largest of them, the machines used in major civil and military engineering projects, generate vibrations that can propagate through rock for miles in all directions. They run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because stopping and restarting them is enormously complex and expensive. If there are TBMs running beneath the American interior, and there is documented evidence that military tunneling operations have used them, then the hum is exactly what you would expect to hear on the surface above them. This is where the story of America's subterranean military complex begins. Not with a conspiracy, not with a revelation handed down by a whistleblower in a parking garage, but with a sound, a vibration, a disturbance in the ordinary that points, for those willing to follow the evidence, toward something extraordinary. Follow it down. The darkness, as it turns out, is full of history. From the bomb to the bunker. The date is August 6, 1945. At 8:15 in the morning, over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, a single bomb detonates at an altitude of approximately 600 meters above the ground. The fireball reaches a temperature of several million degrees. The shock wave spreads outward at supersonic velocity. Buildings, people, infrastructure, everything within a radius of roughly 2 miles is either destroyed immediately or set ablaze. By the end of the day, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people are dead. The city, which had housed hundreds of thousands, is largely gone. The weapon that did this, Little Boy, as it was called, had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. It was the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat. It would not be the last. For the military planners and strategists of the United States, the implications of Hiroshima were immediate, overwhelming, and deeply personal. They had built this weapon. They understood, better than anyone on Earth, what it could do. And they understood something else. If they could build it, others could build it too. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear device. The balance of power that American planners had assumed would last a generation had shifted in an instant. The comfortable assumption that oceans provided strategic depth, that no enemy could credibly threaten the American homeland, had been obliterated just as thoroughly as Hiroshima. A Soviet bomber carrying a nuclear weapon could, in theory, reach Washington in hours. The question of what to do about this produced one of the most sustained and serious strategic debates in American military history. The answers that emerged were varied, and some of them were extraordinary. One answer was deterrence. Build enough nuclear weapons that any Soviet attack would result in the total destruction of the Soviet Union as well. Mutually assured destruction, the doctrine of MAD, a name that acknowledged its own terrible irony, became the cornerstone of American strategic thinking. But deterrence, however rational in theory, had a structural problem. It only worked if the command and control structure that would order the retaliatory strike survived the initial attack. If the first Soviet bombs hit Washington and killed the president and the Joint Chiefs before anyone could authorize a response, deterrence failed. The entire structure collapsed. This was the problem that drove America underground. If the command authority could not survive on the surface, if a sufficiently large and well-targeted first strike could decapitate the American government before a response could be ordered, then the deterrence posture was hollow. The Soviets would know this. Knowing it, they might be tempted to try exactly that. A massive, precisely targeted strike on American leadership, gambling that the shock and disruption would be enough to prevent retaliation. The solution, developed through the late 1940s and refined through the 1950s, was to put the command authority underground. not just to build shelters. Shelters had been part of military thinking since the First World War, but to build fortresses, entire installations buried so deeply in solid rock that even a direct nuclear strike overhead could not destroy them. Places where the president could govern, where the Joint Chiefs could command, where the communications infrastructure of national defense could continue to function after everything on the surface was gone. This was the founding idea of the American underground empire. The first major step was taken not in the dramatic mountains of the West, but in the rolling countryside of Pennsylvania. In 1951, construction began on a facility called Raven Rock Mountain Complex, officially designated as Site R, carved into a granite ridge near the Maryland border. The project was classified, the workers sworn to secrecy, the funding buried in Defense Department appropriations under headings that revealed nothing of what was actually being built. What was built was extraordinary. Raven Rock contains 5 large office buildings, each several stories tall, constructed inside a hollowed-out mountain. The buildings are not attached to the rock. They rest on enormous shock-absorbing springs, each building floating independently to survive the ground shock of a nearby nuclear detonation. The complex has its own power generation, its own water supply from underground springs, its own air filtration systems, its own communications network. It is designed to operate in complete isolation from the outside world for an extended period. Raven Rock was not a bunker. It was a government. A complete, functioning alternative to the surface infrastructure of American executive power, ready to be activated at a moment's notice and capable of sustaining itself through a nuclear war and its aftermath. It was not alone. Mount Weather, constructed in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia beginning in the early 1950s, was built on a similar principle for the continuity of civilian government. The complex, known officially as the Special Facility, houses not just military command capability, but the organizational structure of the civilian federal government, representatives of every cabinet department, copies of critical records, the mechanisms of financial and administrative authority. When Mount Weather was finally acknowledged to exist, following a 1974 aircraft crash near the facility, the breadth of its purpose shocked even well-informed observers. High Point Special Facility in North Carolina, Greenbrier Resort's famous underground shelter in West Virginia, constructed secretly beneath the luxury hotel, used as a congressional relocation facility for 3 decades before its existence was revealed by a journalist. The alternate National Military Command Center buried beneath the Pentagon. These were not isolated projects. They were nodes in a network, a deliberately distributed, redundant, hardened system of underground government designed to survive anything the Soviet arsenal could deliver. And these were the facilities the public eventually learned about, the ones whose existence became acknowledged, whose photographs were published, whose historical significance was recognized. They represent, in all probability, only the visible edge of a much larger and far less transparent construction program. Consider what is publicly known about the scale of Cold War underground construction. Between 1950 and 1990, the United States government spent amounts on classified construction programs that, even with partial disclosure, run to hundreds of billions of dollars in modern equivalents. The Army Corps of Engineers, which manages much of this construction, has a classified construction program whose annual budget, the portion that appears in public records, has been consistently one of the largest in government. What the classified portion funds has never been fully disclosed. Consider also the geography. The United States covers nearly 3.8 million square miles, much of it remote, much of it underlain by the kind of hard igneous and metamorphic rock that makes deep underground construction both practical and defensible. The Rocky Mountains, the Appalachians, the granite batholiths of the American West, these are exactly the geological environments that military planners would choose for underground facilities. And they are environments where construction activity, even on a significant scale, can proceed with minimal observation and minimal public awareness. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved, but the underground construction did not stop. If anything, the pace and ambition of American subterranean military development accelerated through the 1990s and into the 21st century, driven by new strategic considerations that made the original Cold War logic look almost quaint by comparison. The world the planners of the 1950s built against was a world of two superpowers, each with nuclear arsenals and the rational self-interest not to use them. The world of the 21st century is something considerably more complicated and more dangerous. The constitutional question, the geography of vulnerability, was something that American planners understood with uncomfortable precision. Washington, D.C. sits on the Atlantic seaboard, a coastal city reachable by a Soviet bomber approaching over the North Pole in roughly 8 hours at the aircraft speeds available in the early 1950s. The Pentagon, the Capitol, the White House, the headquarters of every branch of the American military, all clustered within a few miles of one another, all within a single bomb's range of complete destruction. The maps that military planners produced in those years, maps overlaying nuclear blast radii on the urban geography of the capital, were the kind of documents that changed a person's relationship to the city they worked in. A 10-megaton device detonated at altitude over downtown Washington would destroy essentially every structure within a radius of several miles. The fireball alone would extend for miles. The immediate death toll would be measured in hundreds of thousands. The disruption to government function would be, in any practical sense, total. This was the scenario the planners were building against, not a conventional military attack, not an invasion, not even the kind of sustained bombardment that had reduced European cities to rubble in the Second World War. A single weapon, a single detonation, and the entire apparatus of American executive authority gone. The legal and constitutional dimension of this possibility was one that received serious attention alongside the engineering dimension. The Constitution of the United States had been written in a world where the death of a president was a tragedy, but not a catastrophe, where the line of succession was orderly and the mechanisms of continuity were sufficient. What the nuclear age had created was a scenario in which the entire line of succession could be eliminated simultaneously, in minutes, with a single weapon. No plan of succession was adequate if the successors were all in the same place. The Presidential Succession Act of 1947 had expanded the line of succession to include the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate, followed by the cabinet secretaries in a specified order. But all of these people were in Washington, All of them were targets. In a sufficiently comprehensive first strike, they would all be dead before any of them had the opportunity to exercise the authority that the succession law was meant to pass to them. The underground facilities built through the 1950s and 1960s were designed, in part, as physical solutions to this constitutional problem. By dispersing government authority, by placing the president and key cabinet members in one secure location, congressional leadership in another, the continuity of government apparatus in a third, planners created a scenario in which at least some fraction of the constitutional order would survive even a devastating first strike. Not all of them could be killed simultaneously if they were distributed across multiple, hardened, secret locations. This logic drove a parallel program alongside the physical construction of underground facilities, the development of continuity of government plans, classification schemes for essential documents, and pre-positioned stockpiles of everything from cash to constitutional interpretations that would be needed by whoever emerged from the underground to govern in the aftermath. Mount Weather, when it was finally partially revealed to the public through investigative journalism in the 1970s and 1980s, was found to contain not just physical infrastructure, but an extensive apparatus of preparatory government. Lists of Americans who would be brought to safety, not just politicians and military officers, but technocrats, scientists, engineers, medical professionals, experts in the full range of knowledge required to rebuild a functioning society. Copies of vital records, monetary reserves, the organizational structure in miniature of every federal department. The journalist Richard Pollock, writing in The Progressive in 1976, described Mount Weather as a shadow government, a phrase that scandalized some readers and seemed paranoid to others, but which was, in its operational intent, accurate. The facility was designed to be exactly that: a shadow, a backup, a second government ready to step into the daylight when the first government had been destroyed. The moral and political dimensions of this preparation were noted and largely set aside. Who decides who goes underground? Who decides which Americans are valuable enough to shelter and which are left to face whatever the surface holds? These questions were answered quietly in classified documents by people whose names were not public, and the answers they reached reflected the values and priorities of the national security bureaucracy of mid-century America. The technical staff of essential industries, the political leadership of the executive branch, the senior military officers, the scientists and engineers whose knowledge was considered irreplaceable. And beyond that, the decision becomes more difficult, and the records of how it was made remain, for the most part, classified. What is certain is that the preparation was comprehensive in a way that revealed the depth of the planners' conviction that the scenario they were preparing for was not hypothetical. They were not building shelters. They were building the institutions of a government that expected to need them. The machine that changed everything. The problem, at its most fundamental, is geological. Rock does not want to be moved. It has spent millions of years being exactly where it is, compressed by the weight of everything above it, bonded at the molecular level by forces that make ordinary excavation, the pick and shovel, even the dynamite charge, inadequate for the scale of what modern underground military construction demands. to move rock quickly, efficiently, and without the surface disruption that would alert observers to what is happening underground, you need something different. You need the tunnel boring machine. A modern TBM is among the most complex pieces of civil engineering equipment ever built. The largest of them are cylinders 15 or 20 meters in diameter, hundreds of meters in total length, capable of cutting through solid granite at rates that would have been unimaginable to the engineers of previous generations. The cutting head, a rotating disc equipped with hundreds of hardened steel disc cutters, presses against the rock face with thousands of tons of force, grinding and chipping the rock into fragments that are then carried backward through the machine on conveyor systems and removed. Behind the cutting head, the TBM installs precast concrete segments that form the permanent tunnel lining, doing this automatically, continuously, as the machine advances. A large TBM in favorable geological conditions can advance 15 to 20 meters per day. In 24 hours, working without pause, it excavates a volume of rock that would take a conventional drill and blast crew weeks to remove. And it does this while generating far less vibration than explosive excavation, producing no surface disturbance and requiring a much smaller crew to operate. For a military program that needs speed, secrecy, and depth, the TBM is the instrument of choice. The existence of classified military TBM programs is not speculation. It is documented. The nuclear subterranean, a project developed at the Los Alamos National Laboratory beginning in the 1960s, was designed to melt rock rather than cut it, using nuclear power to generate the intense heat required. The molten rock would flow to the sides of the tunnel, cool, and form a glass-smooth lining that required no additional material. Prototypes were built and tested. Patents were filed. The technology worked. Whether nuclear subterraneans were ever used in operational underground construction is not something the government has confirmed. But the engineering problem they were designed to solve, creating very large, very deep tunnels very quickly, has not gone away, and the TBM programs that are known to exist have continued to improve, continued to accelerate, and continued to be applied to classified construction projects whose specifics remain outside public knowledge. The engineering of a deep underground military installation is not simply a matter of digging a hole and furnishing it. Every system that the surface world takes for granted, breathable air, clean water, stable temperature, electrical power, communications, must be recreated from scratch in an environment that provides none of them naturally. Air is the most immediate problem. A sealed underground space fills with carbon dioxide from human respiration and depletes its oxygen supply far faster than most people intuitively understand. A group of 100 people in a completely sealed space would exhaust the available oxygen in a matter of hours. The solution is a multi-stage air processing system: intake from the surface through concealed shafts, filtration to remove particulates and biological contaminants, chemical scrubbing to remove carbon dioxide, and controlled circulation throughout the facility. In the event of a nuclear detonation overhead, the intake shafts can be sealed in seconds and internal air recycling activated, a system that regenerates oxygen through chemical reactions and absorbs carbon dioxide through molecular sieves, sustaining life for days or weeks without any connection to the outside atmosphere. The blast overpressure from a nuclear detonation is the other primary engineering challenge. Even at distances where the thermal pulse and initial radiation are not immediately lethal. The pressure wave from a nuclear explosion can collapse structures that were not specifically designed to resist it. The solution, pioneered at Raven Rock and refined through successive generations of underground facilities, is to decouple the internal structure from the surrounding rock. Buildings suspended on spring systems, equipment mounted on shock absorbers, even the connecting tunnels between facilities designed with flexible joints that allow some movement without loss of structural integrity. The internal environment absorbs the shock that the rock transmits and survives. Water is obtained from deep wells and underground aquifers. Most granite massifs contain water-bearing fractures at depth, and facilities are sited to take advantage of these where possible. Power is the greatest long-term constraint. For facilities designed to operate for extended periods without surface connection, the power supply must be entirely self-contained. Nuclear power is the obvious solution, and there are documented instances of nuclear reactors being installed in underground military facilities. The SM-1A reactor at Fort Belvoir in Virginia provided power for surface military facilities beginning in the late 1950s, demonstrating the military's early comfort with nuclear power generation. Compact naval-type reactors, of the kind used to power submarines and aircraft carriers, can be installed in underground spaces and operated without the elaborate cooling infrastructure that civilian nuclear power plants require. They are designed to work in the confined space of a submarine hull, and a deep underground chamber presents fewer engineering challenges than a pressure vessel hundreds of meters underwater. Fuel reserves for diesel generators that serve as backup and supplement nuclear power can be stored in quantities sufficient for years of operation. Deep underground environments are actually nearly ideal for long-term fuel storage. Stable temperatures, low oxygen levels, and the physical security of hundreds of meters of rock provide conditions far superior to surface storage facilities. Communications from deep underground facilities presents its own engineering challenge. Conventional radio frequencies do not penetrate rock to any useful depth. The electromagnetic pulse generated by a nuclear detonation, one of the most dangerous effects for modern electronic infrastructure, propagates through the air, but not to the same degree through solid rock. The advantage of depth cuts both ways. It protects against EMP while also blocking normal radio communications. The solution is a combination of hardened cable connections, extremely low-frequency radio, ELF radio waves, with wavelengths measured in thousands of miles, can penetrate rock and seawater to depths that conventional radio cannot reach, and fiber optic connections that are physically secured at every point between the underground facility and its communications endpoints. The communications architecture of the American underground military network is one of the most classified aspects of the entire program. Its existence is known, but its specifics are protected with unusual rigor, for the obvious reason that a communications network that can be mapped can also be targeted. The human engineering of underground facilities, the design of spaces where people will live and work for extended periods, possibly without ever reaching the surface, is a discipline that has developed enormously since the early Cold War installations. Raven Rock's underground office buildings, with their fluorescent lighting and institutional corridors, were functional but psychologically austere. Modern facilities, Informed by decades of research into the psychology of confined environments, research drawn in part from submarine service, from Antarctic research stations, from long-duration spaceflight, are designed to mitigate the particular stressors of underground life. Natural light is simulated through full-spectrum lighting systems that follow circadian rhythms. Spatial design uses perspective and color to minimize the claustrophobic effect of low ceilings and narrow corridors. Recreation facilities, gymnasiums, common areas, the social spaces that sustain mental health during extended confinement, are incorporated into the design rather than afterthought. The lesson of early submarine service, of early Antarctic expeditions, of any prolonged human habitation in isolated environments, is that the psychological challenges are as serious as the physical ones, and that addressing them in the design stage is far cheaper than dealing with the human consequences of failing to do so. All of this infrastructure, air, water, power, communications, psychological support, must be maintained continuously, tested regularly, and available to activate at a moment's notice. The underground installations of the American military are not storage facilities. They are living systems, staffed by rotating crews of military and civilian personnel, whose existence and functions remain outside public knowledge, maintained in a state of operational readiness for a contingency that everyone hopes will never come. The cost of this readiness is staggering. It is also invisible, buried in classified budget lines, justified by strategic calculations that the public is not invited to evaluate. The underground empire is expensive, and it is ongoing, and it is expanding. And the reasons it continues to expand are worth examining carefully, because they reveal something important about how the American military understands the world it operates in. Cheyenne Mountain and beyond. The term Deep Underground Military Base, DUM, in the acronym Happy Language of military planning, does not appear in any official Defense Department document that has been released to the public. It is a term that emerged from the research community that orbits the edges of official knowledge, used by journalists, by former military personnel speaking off the record, by the community of researchers who spend their professional lives attempting to reconstruct classified infrastructure from declassified fragments, contractor records, geological surveys, and the occasional unguarded statement by someone who should have known better. The term is useful because it distinguishes a specific category of underground military installation from the broader universe of underground facilities. Not every military installation that goes underground qualifies. A hardened communications bunker a few meters below a surface headquarters is underground, but it is not what the term is meant to convey. A DUM, in the sense the term has developed, refers to a major operational installation, one capable of sustained independent operation, housing significant numbers of personnel with independent power and life support, buried at depths measured in hundreds of meters, in most cases without any surface infrastructure that would identify its presence to an aerial observer. By this definition, there are confirmed DUMs. There are probable DUMs, and there are possible DUMs that remain in the territory of informed speculation. The line between these categories is not always clear, and the government's systematic approach to classification makes clarity difficult to achieve through legitimate research. But the confirmed ones are remarkable enough to be worth examining in detail. Cheyenne Mountain Complex is the most famous American underground military installation in existence, partly because it is famous, partly because its existence has been officially acknowledged for decades, and partly because it actually deserves the attention it receives. Construction began in 1961, driven by the same strategic logic that had produced Raven Rock a decade earlier: the need for a command center capable of surviving a nuclear attack. The site chosen was a granite mountain in Colorado, near Colorado Springs, selected for the exceptional hardness of its rock. The granite of Cheyenne Mountain is among the strongest in North America, and for its location in the interior of the continent, maximizing the distance from the ocean approaches that Soviet bombers would use. The excavation of Cheyenne Mountain was an engineering undertaking of remarkable scale. Workers removed over 690,000 tons of rock to create the main cavern, a space large enough to house 15 freestanding steel buildings, each 3 stories tall. The buildings are mounted on over 1,300 springs, each spring a meter in diameter and capable of compressing by 15 inches under the load of a nuclear shock wave. The springs allow the internal structure to move independently of the surrounding rock, absorbing the energy that a nearby detonation would otherwise transmit directly into the buildings. The mountain provides approximately 2,000 feet of granite overhead, a roof so thick that even the largest Soviet thermonuclear warheads of the Cold War era could not guarantee destruction of the installation with a direct hit. The access tunnels include massive blast doors, each weighing 25 tons, capable of being sealed in less than 30 seconds. Inside, Cheyenne Mountain housed the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, through the Cold War. It was the installation from which American and Canadian military personnel monitored Soviet aircraft and missile launches, the place where warning of an inbound nuclear strike would first be received and assessed, the place where the decision to respond would be made and communicated. It was, in a very real sense, the nerve center of American nuclear defense. The end of the Cold War reduced Cheyenne Mountain's operational tempo. The primary NORAD command functions were transferred to Peterson Air Force Base, a surface facility, in 2006. But the mountain was not decommissioned. It was placed in warm standby, a state of reduced but immediate readiness, capable of being fully reactivated within hours. The equipment was maintained, the life support systems were kept operational, the blast doors were not welded shut. In 2015, following a decision by then Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, NORAD began moving some command functions back to Cheyenne Mountain, driven by concerns about electromagnetic pulse vulnerability at the surface Peterson facility. The reason given publicly was specific. The mountain's granite provides substantial protection against EMP, while surface facilities, however well hardened, remain more vulnerable. The move back underground was a strategic decision, not a sentimental one. This decision deserves attention. It was made not by conspiracy theorists, but by the United States Department of Defense. It represents an official acknowledgement that, in the strategic environment of the 21st century, underground facilities provide advantages that surface facilities cannot replicate. The specific threat cited, EMP, points toward a broader concern that has driven military thinking toward the underground more consistently than perhaps any other single factor. An electromagnetic pulse, whether generated by a nuclear detonation at high altitude or by a directed energy weapon, can destroy unprotected electronic infrastructure across an enormous area. The modern American military, and indeed modern American society, depends on electronics to a degree that would have seemed extraordinary to military planners of the 1950s. Every weapon system, every communications link, every navigation system, every logistical network depends on electronic components that are vulnerable to the electromagnetic field generated by an EMP event. The underground environment, surrounded by conducting rock, provides a degree of natural electromagnetic shielding. Facilities can also be hardened with artificial Faraday cage construction, conducting enclosures that prevent electromagnetic fields from penetrating to the electronics inside. The combination of natural rock shielding and artificial hardening makes a deep underground facility substantially more resistant to EMP than any surface installation, regardless of how heavily armored the surface installation might be. This is the strategic logic that drives the continued development of the American underground military complex in the post-Cold War era. The threat is no longer primarily a massive Soviet nuclear first strike. The threats are more varied, more diffuse, and in some ways more difficult to defend against. Cyber attacks, EMP weapons, precision conventional strikes using satellite-guided munitions that can hit a specific building with meter-level accuracy. Against all of these threats, depth provides protection that no amount of surface hardening can match. Area 51, officially the Nevada Test and Training Range, sometimes called Groom Lake for the dry lake bed on which its runway is constructed, occupies a unique position in the landscape of American underground military installations. It is simultaneously the most famous and the least understood facility in the American military complex. Its existence was officially acknowledged by the CIA in 2013, when declassified documents confirmed what had been known to aviation enthusiasts and military researchers for decades. The facility is real, it is large, it is heavily secured, and it has been the site of classified aircraft development programs since the 1950s. What is less clear is what lies beneath it. The surface installation at Area 51 is visible in commercial satellite imagery. It includes runways, hangars, administrative buildings, and the various support infrastructure of an active military testing facility. What the satellite imagery cannot show is the underground component, and there are strong indications based on former employee accounts, geological assessments, and the sheer scale of some of what has been observed at the surface that the underground component is substantial. Former contractors who have worked at Area 51, some speaking under conditions of anonymity that they have maintained carefully, aware of the legal consequences of unauthorized disclosure, describe multi-level underground facilities connected to the surface buildings by elevator systems. The levels descend to depths that vary in the accounts, anywhere from 3 or 4 levels to considerably more, and contain spaces used for classified research, secure storage, and command functions that would be destroyed by any surface attack. The geological context supports this. Groom Lake sits at the edge of a volcanic field, but the surrounding mountains are largely granite and hard limestone, materials well suited to underground construction. The facility has its own power generation capacity that is substantially larger than what its known surface operations would require. The workforce it employs Again, based on contractor accounts and estimates derived from the bus service that transports workers from Las Vegas, is considerably larger than the surface footprint would suggest. None of this is confirmation. It is inference, pattern recognition, the kind of analytical reasoning that produces high probability estimates rather than certainties. What is certain is that Area 51 has been used for 70 years as the primary site for developing the most classified aircraft systems in the American military: the U-2, the SR-71, the F-117, and that the program of classified aircraft development has continued without interruption. The current generation of classified aircraft programs that exist as budget line items even when their contents are entirely classified, are almost certainly in advanced development. The question of where that development is occurring and how much of it is underground is one that the government has chosen not to answer. Dulce, New Mexico presents a different category of challenge. The small town sits near the Colorado border in the high desert, on or near the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. It is remote, sparsely populated, and largely unknown outside the specific community of researchers who have made it their focus. The claims associated with Dulce of a massive underground base connected to alien technology, of underground levels descending to depths of thousands of feet, of joint human-alien research programs, are in the territory of what researchers charitably call unverified and what critics call fantastical. The specific claims originated with a small number of individuals whose credibility is contested and whose accounts have not been corroborated by independent evidence of the kind that supports the documented underground facilities. What is verifiable is considerably more modest: that Dulce sits in an area of unusual geological complexity, that there has been persistent military and government activity in the surrounding region, and that some former residents report anomalous phenomena, unexplained sounds, unusual aircraft activity, periods of apparent restricted access to normally public land that remain unexplained by publicly available information. The distinction between the documented and the claimed matters. The underground empire of the American military is remarkable enough in its confirmed dimensions that it does not need embellishment. What is confirmed? Raven Rock, Mount Weather, Cheyenne Mountain, the network of continuity of government facilities that has been partially disclosed through official acknowledgement and investigative journalism, represents an extraordinary achievement of engineering and political will. Adding layers of unverified claims to this foundation does not illuminate the story. It obscures it, and in doing so, inadvertently protects the genuine secrets by associating them with claims that can be easily dismissed. The genuine underground empire is not science fiction. It is science, engineering, and strategic calculation, carried out over 70 years at enormous cost, buried beneath the surface of a country whose citizens largely have no idea it exists. Area 51. Myth and Machinery. The story of Area 51 is, in many ways, the story of American secrecy at its most consequential and its most self-defeating. For decades, the government denied the existence of a facility that thousands of people worked at, that was visible in commercially available satellite imagery, and that had been the subject of detailed reporting by aviation enthusiasts and national security journalists since at least the 1970s. The denial was not stupid. It reflected a specific security calculus that acknowledging the facility would require either explaining what it was for or admitting that there were things happening there that could not be explained publicly. The first option would disclose classified aircraft programs. The second option would invite exactly the kind of speculation about exotic technologies and alien involvement that the government found embarrassing. The government chose the third option: deny. Deny officially, deny vigorously, deny even to members of Congress who asked uncomfortable questions about the aircraft being seen near the facility by civilian pilots who had no idea what they were looking at. The aircraft program that drove the original development of Area 51 was the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, developed by the Lockheed Skunk Works beginning in the mid-1950s. The U-2 flew at altitudes that no existing Soviet interceptor or missile system could reach, above 70,000 feet, at the very edge of the atmosphere where the sky darkens toward black and the curvature of the Earth is visible. From that altitude, its cameras could photograph targets with extraordinary detail. It could overfly the Soviet Union and return with imagery that revealed the true state of Soviet military development. The secrecy around the U-2 program was absolute, or meant to be. The testing flights over the Nevada desert at altitudes and speeds that no ordinary aircraft could match produced sightings by civilians and airline pilots who reported them to the FAA. The FAA, aware of the classified program, investigated and closed the files without explanation. The UFO reports that accumulated through the late 1950s, craft moving at speeds and altitudes that seemed impossible, performing maneuvers that conventional aircraft could not, were, in many cases, U-2S and later SR-71S, performing exactly as designed. This is the origin of the connection between Area 51 and UFO mythology, and it is a connection that the government, for its own reasons, chose not to correct. A population convinced it was seeing alien spacecraft was a population that wasn't asking the right questions about classified aircraft development programs. The mythology served the secrecy. It also, in the long run, complicated the secrecy in ways that the original planners did not anticipate. By the time the government acknowledged Area 51's existence in 2013, the facility had been embedded in popular culture for decades as the site of alien contact and reverse-engineered extraterrestrial technology. The acknowledgement that it was, in fact, a classified aircraft testing facility, remarkable in its own right, but entirely human in its origin and purpose, struck many observers as insufficient. The mythology had grown too large to be displaced by the reality. The underground dimension of Area 51 has not been officially acknowledged in the same way as the surface facility. What is known comes from the accounts of former workers, accounts that describe, with varying degrees of specificity, underground levels connected to the surface buildings by elevators, classified laboratory spaces built below the ground surface, and storage facilities of a scale that the known surface operations do not explain. The function of underground space at Area 51, if it exists to the degree suggested by these accounts, is not primarily about surviving nuclear attack, though that protection would be incidental. It is about secrecy. An aircraft component in an above-ground hangar can be photographed from orbit by any of the reconnaissance satellites operated by adversary nations. The same component in an underground laboratory cannot. The strategic value of underground space for classified research and development is not primarily hardening. It is concealment. This is a dimension of the underground military complex that receives less attention than the survival of command function, but it may be equally important. The development of classified weapon systems, aircraft, missiles, electronic warfare equipment, and categories of weapon that the government has not publicly described requires physical spaces that cannot be observed from the air. The underground provides those spaces in a way that no surface facility can match. The history of classified aircraft development at Area 51, from the U-2 through the SR-71 to the F-117 to the B-2 and the programs that followed them, is a history of technologies that transformed military aviation, each of them developed in complete secrecy over periods of years, each of them eventually declassified when the operational advantage of secrecy was exhausted and the political and historical value of disclosure outweighed it. The programs currently in development, the ones that will represent the next transformation of military aviation, are presumably undergoing the same process in the same or similar spaces. Where those spaces are, how deep they go, and what they contain, these remain questions that the government has declined to answer. A deep underground military facility that cannot sustain itself is a bunker. What the American military has built over 7 decades of classified construction goes considerably further than a bunker. It is infrastructure, the same word used to describe highways and power grids and water treatment plants, except that this infrastructure is invisible to most of the people it serves and serves them specifically by being ready to function when everything visible has been destroyed. The logistics of the underground are a discipline in their own right, and they are more demanding than the logistics of any surface operation for reasons that are specific to the environment. On the surface, if a system fails, you drive to the hardware store. Underground, if a system fails, you fix it with what you have, or you don't fix it. The supply chain for a sealed underground facility is measured not in delivery times, but in stockpiled depths, the number of months or years that the facility can sustain operations without any external input. This requirement for deep stockpiling drives facility size in ways that are not immediately obvious. A facility designed to sustain 500 people for 1 year needs not just space for those people to live and work, but enormous volumes of stored supplies, food, water treatment chemicals, medical supplies, spare parts for every system that might fail, fuel for backup power generation, clothing, communications equipment, the entire material infrastructure of sustained human habitation. The storage requirement, in many cases, exceeds the operational space requirement. The underground city is largely warehouse. Food storage in major underground facilities is understood to follow military preservation standards that maximize caloric density and shelf life. Freeze-dried and dehydrated rations, properly sealed and stored at the stable temperatures characteristic of deep underground environments, typically around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the natural temperature of rock at depths of a few hundred feet, can remain nutritionally viable for 25 years or more. The energy required to prepare them, rehydration, cooking, is minimal, which is important in an environment where power conservation is a strategic priority. Water is a more complex problem. Underground facilities can access aquifer water through deep wells, but the yield of any given well is finite, and the quality of deep aquifer water, which often carries dissolved minerals at concentrations that require treatment before it is safe to drink, must be managed carefully. Large underground facilities maintain water storage capacity measured in millions of gallons, along with treatment systems capable of purifying both stored water and well water to drinking standards. Recycling of gray water, the water from sinks, showers, and food preparation, reduces the demand on primary water supplies significantly, and the technology for doing this efficiently has improved dramatically since the Cold War era. Medical care in an isolated underground environment presents challenges that military planners have had to think carefully about. A major surgery requiring specialist equipment and expertise is impossible in a facility without those resources, however much food and water it may have stored. The solution, implemented in larger facilities, is to staff them with medical personnel capable of a wide range of interventions, and to equip them with operating theater capability sufficient for emergency surgery. The pharmaceutical stockpile of a major underground facility is extensive. Antibiotics, anesthetics, surgical supplies, medications for the chronic conditions that will exist in any population large enough to staff the facility. The goal is not a hospital. It is capability sufficient to keep people functioning and alive through any condition likely to arise during the facility's period of isolated operation. Power is the operational heartbeat of the underground installation. Without power, every other system fails. The air stops circulating, the water stops pumping, the communications go dark, the lights go out, and with them, everything that makes the difference between a functional military headquarters and an extraordinarily expensive hole in the ground. The redundant power architecture of major underground facilities typically includes 3 tiers. The primary tier is connection to the surface electrical grid. In normal operations, facilities draw power from the same utility infrastructure as any other military installation. The secondary tier is diesel generation. Large banks of diesel generators capable of providing full facility power, with fuel stored in sufficient quantities to sustain operations for months without resupply. The tertiary tier, in the most significant installations, is nuclear. Compact reactor systems of the type used in naval vessels, capable of providing effectively unlimited power for the design life of the installation without any external fuel requirement. The transition between these tiers is automated. A power failure on the surface grid triggers automatic startup of the diesel generators within seconds. If diesel power becomes unavailable, or if the facility is sealed against surface contact, nuclear power provides the final backstop. This architecture, designed with the catastrophic scenario of total surface infrastructure destruction in mind, means that the facility can continue to function regardless of what has happened above it. Communications present a different kind of problem. The underground environment that protects against physical destruction also blocks the radio frequencies on which modern military communications depend. The solution is a multi-layer communications architecture that provides redundant pathways for every critical connection. The first layer is hardened cable, fiber optic connections running through buried conduit from the underground facility to communications infrastructure at a distance from the installation. These cables are physically protected against blast effects at every point. and they terminate in locations that are themselves hardened against surface attack. They are vulnerable to deliberate cutting, which is why they are supplemented by other means. The second layer is extremely low-frequency radio. LF signals, with frequencies measured in tens of hertz and wavelengths of thousands of kilometers, propagate through rock and seawater to depths that higher frequency signals cannot reach. The American military has operated ELF transmitter systems, used primarily to communicate with submerged submarines, and the same physical principles that make ELF useful for submarine communication make it useful for deep underground communication. The data rate is extremely low. ELF is not suitable for voice communication or data transfer, but it is sufficient for the transmission of brief, critical messages. Launch authorization codes, warning signals, essential command traffic. The third layer is satellite communication, accessible from the surface through hardened antenna systems that can be deployed quickly after the initial blast effects have passed. Satellites in high orbits survive nuclear attacks on the surface. Their communication links, however, terminate at surface or near-surface infrastructure that may be destroyed. The underground facility's communications plan accounts for the possibility that satellite links will be unavailable for an initial period and designs around that constraint. Taken together, this communications architecture provides what military planners call assured communication, the near certainty that, regardless of what has happened on the surface, the command authority in the underground installation can receive information about the situation and transmit orders to whatever forces remain capable of executing them. The human population of major underground military facilities is the variable that, in some ways, most eludes public knowledge. The number of people permanently assigned to these installations, the number of civilians who are part of continuity of government programs and would shelter in them during an emergency, the number of contractors and support personnel who maintain them. None of these figures are publicly available in anything approaching a complete form. What is known suggests the numbers are significant. Raven Rock is publicly described as capable of housing several thousand people during an emergency. Mount Weather, similarly, is described in the limited public documentation as a facility with substantial personnel capacity, the kind of facility that can house not just a command staff, but the operational workforce of a shadow government. Cheyenne Mountain, at its peak Cold War operation, employed over 1,000 military and civilian personnel on rotating shifts. Extrapolated across the network of confirmed and probable underground facilities, the underground military population of the United States, the people who work in these installations, maintain them, and would shelter in them in the event of a major attack, is almost certainly measured in tens of thousands. They are the invisible workforce of an invisible infrastructure, and their existence is one of the most consequential facts about American national security that most Americans do not know. The Cold War ended more than 30 years ago. The Soviet Union dissolved. The strategic threat that drove the original construction of the American underground empire, the fear of a massive nuclear first strike aimed at decapitating American command authority, has not vanished, but it has changed in character. Russia maintains a large nuclear arsenal, but the relationship between the two countries, however strained, is governed by a different logic than the existential confrontation of the Cold War years. The apocalyptic scenarios that kept the designers of Raven Rock and Cheyenne Mountain awake at night are not the primary concerns of today's strategic planners. So why is the underground complex continuing to grow? The answer involves a convergence of strategic threats that are in some ways more diverse and in some ways more worrying than the nuclear standoff of the Cold War. Understanding them requires a brief survey of the security environment that the 21st century has created, an environment in which the advantages of depth are, if anything, more pronounced than they were during the period that originally drove underground construction. The first and most immediately obvious threat is the proliferation of precision munitions. During the Cold War, the primary challenge of nuclear targeting was yield. How large a bomb was required to destroy a hardened underground facility? The answer, very large, with some uncertainty about the exact relationship between depth and survivability, drove both the design of American facilities and the development of Soviet warheads. In the 21st century, the precision problem has largely been solved. Modern satellite-guided conventional munitions can strike within meters of a target. Bunker-busting warheads, conventional explosives designed to penetrate hardened structures before detonating, have been developed and refined to the point where they can destroy facilities that would have survived any Cold War conventional attack. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the largest conventional bomb in the American arsenal, can penetrate more than 60 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. The response to bunker-busting munitions is depth. A facility buried under 200 feet of reinforced concrete may be vulnerable to the GBU-57. A facility buried under 600 feet of solid granite is not. The geological properties of hard rock, its density, its ability to dissipate shock energy laterally, its resistance to penetration, provide protection against conventional precision munitions that reinforced concrete, however thick, cannot match. Going deeper is not a Cold War strategy. It is a response to the very specific threat posed by modern precision conventional weapons. The second threat is hypersonic delivery systems. Russia and China have both developed and fielded hypersonic glide vehicles, weapons that travel at speeds in excess of Mach 5, following unpredictable trajectories that make them extremely difficult to intercept. Conventional ballistic missiles follow predictable parabolic trajectories that can be tracked and, with sufficient warning, intercepted by modern missile defense systems. A hypersonic glide vehicle, by contrast, can maneuver during flight, changing its trajectory and making its final approach angle unpredictable until it is too close to intercept. Against hypersonic weapons, the response time available to decision-makers is measured in minutes. The command authority that responds to a hypersonic attack must be capable of making and communicating decisions within the few minutes between detection and impact. A surface facility, however hardened, that can be destroyed by a hypersonic weapon within 5 minutes of launch detection is not an adequate command platform. An underground facility that can survive the impact and continue to function is. The strategic value of survival time in the command structure is something that military planners have understood since the earliest days of nuclear strategy. But hypersonic weapons have sharpened the mathematics considerably. The deeper the facility, the more time the command authority has after an attack begins to assess what is happening and make decisions about response. Even a survival advantage of a few minutes can be the difference between a coherent response and chaos. The third threat, and in many ways the most novel, is cyber warfare and electronic attack. The digital infrastructure on which modern military operations depend is vulnerable to attack in ways that the physical infrastructure is not. A sophisticated cyber attack can disable power grids, corrupt communications networks, disrupt financial systems, and degrade the electronic systems on which weapon platforms depend, without a single missile being launched. The attribution of such attacks is often uncertain, making response decisions complicated, and the effects can be as strategically significant as a conventional military strike. Against cyber attacks on the surface infrastructure, underground facilities provide a different kind of advantage. Not cybersecurity in the technical sense. Computers in an underground facility are not inherently more secure against hacking than computers anywhere else. But physical security of the infrastructure that the computers depend on. Power supplies that cannot be remotely switched off. Communications links that cannot be cut by attacking a surface junction box. Physical isolation that prevents certain classes of electronic attack from reaching the facility at all. The fourth threat is the EMP that drove the decision to move some NORAD functions back to Cheyenne Mountain in 2015. Electromagnetic pulse generated either by a high-altitude nuclear detonation or by a specialized non-nuclear weapon. An EMP powerful enough to affect a continental-scale area can destroy unprotected electronics over that entire area simultaneously. The consequences for a military that depends on electronics for every function, navigation, targeting, communications, logistics, even the detonation systems of its own weapons, would be catastrophic. The Faraday shielding that underground facilities can provide, combined with the natural electromagnetic attenuation of surrounding rock, makes them substantially more survivable in an EMP environment than any surface facility. The decision to harden against EMP is not paranoia. It is a response to a demonstrated threat. Nuclear devices have been detonated at high altitude as early as 1962 in tests that destroyed electronics over enormous areas. The technological means to create EMP effects without nuclear weapons have been developed and are believed to be in the arsenals of several state actors. Against this background of converging threats, precision munitions, hypersonic delivery, cyber attack, EMP, the underground military complex is not a relic of Cold War thinking. It is an actively evolving response to the specific strategic challenges of the 21st century, and it is evolving in directions that the public has only limited visibility into. The classified construction budget of the United States government, the portion of military spending that is designated as classified and whose specifics are not disclosed in public budget documents, has consistently been among the largest categories of government expenditure since the Cold War. In recent years, as concerns about near-peer competition with China and Russia have driven a broad modernization of American military capability, classified construction spending has increased. The destinations of that spending are, by definition, not publicly disclosed. What is observable from publicly available information provides suggestive clues. There has been an increase in the use of specialized construction contractors who work exclusively on classified projects. There has been documented activity in geological surveys and site assessments in several regions of the American interior that have no obvious civilian explanation. There are procurement records, partially visible through the federal contracting system, for specialized underground construction equipment, drilling rigs, TBM components, ventilation systems of the kind used in deep underground installations that points toward active construction. None of this is definitive. The inference that classified underground construction is ongoing requires accepting that the convergence of these data points reflects what it appears to reflect rather than some alternative explanation. But the strategic logic for continued underground construction is not obscure, and the government's own public statements, the return of some NORAD functions to Cheyenne Mountain, the explicit acknowledgement that EMP protection drove that decision, the continued maintenance and upgrading of known underground facilities confirm that the underground complex is considered operationally relevant. The frontier of underground military construction is not where it was in the 1960s. The engineering has improved. The machines are larger and faster. The understanding of underground environments, their geology, their ecology, their behavior under various stress conditions, is orders of magnitude more sophisticated than it was when the first shafts were sunk into the granite of Raven Rock. And the strategic case for going deeper, for making the critical infrastructure of American command and control physically invulnerable to the weapons that adversaries have built, has not weakened. If anything, it has strengthened. There is something worth pausing on in the midst of all this engineering and strategy that the technical vocabulary of military planning can obscure. The underground empire is built by people. It is maintained by people. It exists in its ultimate purpose to preserve the capacity of people to govern and defend a country whose surface, in the scenario the planners most fear, would no longer be safe for them. The men and women who work in the rotation of underground military assignments, the crews who monitor the NORAD warning systems, the technical staff who maintain the life support systems, the classified workers who perform functions whose names and purposes remain outside public knowledge, are living out a specific version of the social contract that military service represents. They are putting themselves, their careers, and in some cases, their knowledge of extraordinary things into the service of a strategic architecture that most of the population they protect has never been told about. The founders of this architecture, the planners and engineers of the 1950s who looked at the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and drew from it the conclusion that American government would need to go underground, were responding to a genuine threat with a genuine solution. Whether the solution was wise in every dimension, whether the secrecy surrounding it has served democracy well, whether the money spent on underground hardening could have produced better security through other means, these are questions worth asking, and they are questions that the secrecy around the program makes it very difficult to answer from the outside. What cannot be disputed is the achievement to take the geological structure of a continent and turn it into a strategic resource, to identify mountains that could be hollowed, and ridges that could be reinforced, and valleys that could be tunneled through, and to do this systematically, continuously, over 7 decades, producing an infrastructure that genuinely alters the strategic calculus available to an adversary considering an attack. This is remarkable. It is an achievement of engineering and of sustained political will that has few parallels in the history of human construction. It is also unfinished. The underground empire is not a monument. It is a living system, growing and changing in response to a strategic environment that is not stabilized and shows no signs of doing so. The machines are still running somewhere below. The engineers are still drawing plans. The rock is still being moved. What the underground reveals about us. Consider what the underground tells us about the people who built it, and what it tells us about ourselves. The impulse that drove Neolithic miners to descend 30 feet into chalk with antler picks, following a seam of quality flint that could not be found at the surface. That impulse is recognizable in the classified engineers who descended into Cheyenne Mountain's granite with tunnel-boring machines and dynamite, following a different kind of imperative, but driven by the same fundamental logic. There is something valuable below, and the only way to get it is to go down. The Bronze Age miners of Great Orme in Wales, who worked copper ore from passages so narrow that only children could work the deepest seams. Their descendants appear in every military construction program that has hired the smallest, most flexible specialists to perform tasks in confined underground spaces that larger people literally cannot do. The physical constraints of underground work have not changed in 4,000 years. Human ingenuity navigating those constraints has produced, across that span, an unbroken tradition of going deeper. What has changed, what the American underground military complex represents as a departure from the long tradition of underground construction, is the scale of the secret. The Neolithic miners of Norfolk were not hiding from anyone. The Bronze Age copper traders of Wales were engaged in commerce that, however distant from modern financial systems, was fundamentally public. Copper mined, copper traded, copper transformed into tools that circulated through the ancient world's economy. Even the Romans, who brought industrial organization to their mining operations at Dolaucothi and throughout the empire, left records, tax receipts, property registries, engineering documents that allow modern researchers to reconstruct what they did and why. The American underground military complex leaves records too, but the records are classified, and the classification system that protects them is itself defended by law, by institutional culture, and by the genuine strategic rationale that some things, if known to adversaries, lose their value. A hardened command facility whose location is secret provides protection that an equally hardened facility whose location is publicly known cannot. The secrecy is not incidental to the function. It is part of the function. This creates a democratic problem that has no clean solution. A government that builds cities underground and populates them with a workforce that the public is not informed about, spending money that the public is not told about in response to threats that the public is not fully briefed on. This is a government that has moved some of its most consequential activities beyond the reach of democratic oversight. The congressional committees that receive classified briefings on underground military programs are themselves bound by classification. The journalists who might investigate are blocked by the same laws that protect the programs. The citizens who fund these installations through their taxes are, almost by design, the last people to know what their money has built. This is not a new problem. It is a problem as old as the national security state, which is to say, as old as the nuclear age. It was identified by Eisenhower in his famous warning about the military-industrial complex, a warning that came, it is worth noting, from a man who, as Supreme Allied Commander and as President, had more direct knowledge of classified military programs than almost anyone in American history. His concern was not that the programs were illegitimate. It was that their scale and their opacity placed them outside the normal mechanisms of democratic accountability, and that this placement, once established, would prove very difficult to reverse. He was right. The underground complex has grown continuously and without significant public debate for 7 decades. It has grown through administrations of both parties, through periods of reduced and increased tension, through the end of the Cold War that was supposed to make much of it unnecessary. It persists because the strategic logic that originally justified it has not been refuted. It has, in some ways, been strengthened by developments in precision munitions and electronic warfare that the planners of the 1950s could not have anticipated. The underground empire will not go away. The geology that makes it possible is permanent. The strategic imperatives that drive it are deeply rooted in the nature of modern conflict. The engineering capability that builds and maintains it grows more sophisticated with every decade. What will change, what can be changed, if the political will exists to change it, is the degree to which its existence and its purposes are understood by the citizens it serves. The first step in that direction is knowledge, not the specific operational details that would genuinely compromise security if disclosed, not the location of facilities or the specifics of their communications architecture or the classified details of their design, but the broad fact of their existence, their historical development, their strategic rationale, and their ongoing relevance. These are things that American citizens can know without compromising the security that the underground complex provides. What you know about this program is, in all probability, considerably less than what exists. What the government knows and has chosen not to share is considerably more. The gap between those two bodies of knowledge is not simply a matter of classification. It is a measure of the distance between the government's understanding of its own strategic situation and the public's understanding of what is being done in their name. The underground is where the government goes when it is most serious about survival. The fact that it has built so much of it tells you something important about how serious the threat environment is judged to be. The fact that you are only now learning how much of it exists tells you something important about how the relationship between government and citizens operates in the domain of national security. Both of those things are worth knowing. The geology of survival. The geology of the American West is, from the perspective of underground military construction, almost absurdly generous. The Rocky Mountain system, the spine of the continent, running from New Mexico through Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana into Canada, is composed largely of granite and other hard igneous rocks formed by the cooling of magma during ancient volcanic episodes. These are exactly the materials that underground military construction prefers. Hard enough to be self-supporting over large spans without extensive lining, dense enough to provide effective radiation shielding, and geologically stable enough to remain so for millennia. The granite batholiths of the American West, the great masses of intrusive igneous rock that form the cores of mountain ranges, were emplaced between 80 and 100 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, when the North American plate was overriding the Pacific plate and generating the volcanic activity that built the Rockies. They have been cooling ever since, and in their current state, they are among the most stable geological formations on Earth. They do not move, they do not settle, they do not swell or shrink with moisture changes. They are, in the vocabulary of geotechnical engineering, ideal host rock for deep underground construction. The Appalachians tell a different story, geologically, but an equally useful one for underground construction. These mountains are old, ancient by the standards of North American geology, their roots reaching back to Precambrian time. The rocks are metamorphic, transformed by heat and pressure over hundreds of millions of years into materials of extraordinary hardness and stability. The granite of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where Mount Weather is located, has been in roughly its current condition for several 100 million years. It is not going anywhere. The practical consequence of this geological stability is that underground facilities constructed in hard rock require relatively little structural support. Unlike construction in softer materials, sedimentary rocks, soils, unconsolidated deposits, hard rock tunnels can span considerable distances without additional lining. The natural arch of the tunnel provides structural support, and the surrounding rock acts as a continuous beam, distributing loads laterally rather than allowing them to concentrate on the tunnel crown. For the designers of Cheyenne Mountain, the granite of the Colorado Front Range was not just a convenient location, it was a structural element of the facility's defense. 2,000 feet of granite overhead is not just insulation against the effects of a nuclear detonation at the surface. It is a structural barrier that no conventional weapon currently in existence can penetrate. The probability of a single weapon destroying the facility's operational capability, even with a direct hit, is essentially zero. Against a nuclear weapon, the probability depends on yield and detonation point, but at the depths achieved in the Cheyenne Mountain complex, the overpressure from even a large thermonuclear device would be reduced to survivable levels by the time it propagated through that much rock. The relationship between geology and facility design goes beyond the selection of host rock. The groundwater regime of the host rock determines the water supply available to the facility and the drainage challenges that must be managed. Fracture systems in the rock, the network of cracks and joints that allows water and air to move through what appears to be solid material, determine both the stability of excavations and the pathways through which surface conditions might eventually affect the underground environment. The geological surveys that precede underground military construction are among the most sophisticated geotechnical investigations performed anywhere. Core samples taken at depth provide information about rock strength, fracture intensity, mineral content, and groundwater chemistry. Seismic surveys create three-dimensional models of the rock structure at depths that no drill can reach directly. Electromagnetic surveys reveal the presence of water-bearing fractures and mineral deposits that would affect construction or long-term facility performance. This geological intelligence, accumulated over decades of investigation in areas of strategic interest, is itself a classified asset. The detailed knowledge of subsurface conditions that the American military has developed in the regions where its underground facilities are concentrated represents a competitive advantage in the ongoing challenge of expanding those facilities. Every new facility benefits from the knowledge accumulated by the ones that preceded it. The geological record also extends downward in time in a way that is relevant to the strategic logic of underground construction. The rock of Cheyenne Mountain was formed during the same geological events that produced the ore deposits of Colorado's mining district, events that occurred when the continent was being built by volcanic processes that have not operated in North America for tens of millions of years. The stability that makes the granite ideal for underground construction is the product of geological time operating at scales that make human history look instantaneous. There is something philosophically significant in this scale. The underground facilities of the American military are built in rock that has been undisturbed, essentially, since before the dinosaurs. The concerns that drove their construction, the nuclear arsenals of rival nations, the strategic calculations of mid-20th century geopolitics, are themselves the products of a few decades of human history, a geological eye blink. The rock will still be there when those concerns are long forgotten. Whether the facilities will be as well, whether the underground empire that the Cold War built will persist into geological time in any meaningful sense, is a question that combines engineering with history in ways that are difficult to predict. The Cornish tin mines, abandoned when the economics of mining changed, have survived in recognizable form for a century of post-industrial history. The ancient mines of Great Orme in Wales are still intact after 4,000 years, their Bronze Age tool marks still visible on the tunnel walls. The underground environment, as the archaeological record shows with extraordinary consistency, preserves what the surface destroys. The underground facilities of the American military may, in some distant future, provide future archaeologists with the same kind of direct physical connection to the concerns and capabilities of the 21st century that the ancient mines of Britain provide to the concerns and capabilities of the Bronze Age. The irony would be complete. Structures built to be invisible, built to survive precisely because they are hidden from the weapons of their era, becoming permanent records of the era that built them, available to whatever civilization eventually has the technology and the interest to go down and look. The invisible workforce. The human dimension of the underground military complex is one that receives almost no public attention, partly because the people involved are bound by secrecy oaths that carry serious legal consequences for violation, partly because the facilities they work in are themselves secret, and partly because the culture of the national security community has historically been one of discretion that verges on erasure of individual identity. But there are people down there. There have been people working in these facilities in rotating shifts for 70 years. The experience of living and working underground, of spending a significant fraction of one's professional life in artificially lit spaces deep below the surface, disconnected from the natural rhythms of day and night, under the particular psychological pressures of classified work in isolated environments, is an experience that shapes people in ways that are not well documented, but are real. The research on psychological effects of underground confinement comes primarily from submarine service, which represents the closest analog to underground military base assignment in terms of duration, isolation, and the combination of high stakes and enforced inactivity that characterizes much of the work. Submariners spend months at a time in enclosed spaces, working rotating shifts that disconnect them from natural light cycles, performing functions that are critical in the abstract, but rarely urgent in any immediate sense. The psychological effects are well studied, and they are significant. Disruption of sleep patterns, increased interpersonal friction, difficulty with reintegration into surface life following extended deployments. The underground military installation presents similar challenges in some respects and different ones in others. The duration of assignments varies. Some personnel rotate through short assignments of weeks or months, while others may spend years associated with a particular facility. The work is not the physical labor of submarine operation, but the bureaucratic and technical work of a military headquarters. Planning, communications, maintenance, the management of classified information. It is demanding in different ways than submarine service, and its psychological effects are correspondingly different. The classification culture that surrounds underground military assignments adds a dimension that submarine service does not share to the same degree. A submariner can tell their family what they do for a living, even if they can't tell them where they've been. Personnel assigned to highly classified underground facilities may be unable to discuss their work in any meaningful way, even with their families. The isolation that classification imposes extends beyond the physical walls of the facility and into the personnel's entire social life. This isolation has costs that are not captured in any official accounting. Personnel whose spouses don't know where they work or what they do for extended periods. Children who grow up knowing only that their parent goes somewhere classified and comes back quieter than before. Relationships strained by a secrecy that cannot be explained or justified in personal terms because the justification itself is classified. The men and women who have staffed the American underground military complex for 7 decades represent an invisible workforce of a kind that has few parallels in American professional life. They have access to information that most of their fellow citizens cannot imagine. They work in spaces that most of their fellow citizens don't know exist. And they carry the weight of that knowledge, the specific psychological weight of knowing things that cannot be shared through the entirety of their professional lives and, often, beyond retirement. Their labor is not acknowledged in the public record. Their names do not appear in histories of the facilities they maintained. Their professional achievements, the maintenance of critical systems, the management of classified programs, the routine competence that keeps an extraordinary infrastructure operational, are invisible by design. They are, in the most literal sense, the anonymous workforce of a hidden empire, the parallel to the anonymous miners of Britain's ancient mines, the uncounted children who worked the narrow passages of Great Orme, the women who dressed ore on the surface of Cornish mines, the lead miners of Derbyshire who died of miner's asthma in middle age, is imperfect but real. The people who built and maintained that underground empire also left no names in the record. Their labor is present everywhere in the material culture of the ancient world, in the copper of Greek bronzes and the tin of Etruscan vessels, but their identities are lost. The personnel of America's underground military complex are not dying of silicosis in middle age. Their working conditions, by the standards of any era, are good, but they share with those ancient miners the particular condition of laboring in the dark, for purposes that the surface world does not fully understand, and of doing so without acknowledgement or recognition from the society their work serves. They deserve better than that. So did the miners of Great Orme. How the Underground Empire was built in waves. The history of American underground military construction is not a single continuous program, but a series of waves, each driven by a specific strategic development or technological advance that changed the calculus of underground construction. The first wave ran from approximately 1950 to 1965, driven by the initial shock of Soviet nuclear capability and the urgent need to establish some form of command continuity against the threat of a devastating first strike. This wave produced the facilities that are now most well known: Raven Rock, Mount Weather, the early Cheyenne Mountain construction, the network of continuity of government sites that were built at classified locations throughout the eastern United States. The engineering of this period was impressive, but constrained by the technology available: conventional drill and blast excavation, early diesel power generation, communication systems that now seem archaic. The facilities built in this wave were functional, but they were also revealing of their era. Large, somewhat inflexible, designed around the specific threat picture of early Cold War strategic thinking. The second wave ran roughly from 1965 to 1980, driven by the maturation of both Soviet offensive capability and American underground construction technology. The TBMs that became available during this period allowed faster construction at greater depths. Nuclear power generation technology, refined through the Navy's submarine program, made it possible to plan facilities with effectively unlimited power supply. Improvements in life support technology extended the duration of isolated operation that facilities could sustain. And the strategic logic of the period, the development of MIRV, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle technology, which allowed a single missile to carry multiple warheads against multiple targets, meant that the threat to command facilities had increased qualitatively as well as quantitatively. Facilities that had been designed to survive a single large warhead now needed to survive a coordinated attack using many smaller ones, distributed across a target area. The response was a second generation of facilities, deeper and more hardened than the first, designed with more sophisticated redundancy and more distributed communications architecture. The extent of this second wave of construction is less well documented than the first, because many of the facilities built during this period remain classified in ways that the first wave facilities, now partly historical, have been partially declassified. The third wave, beginning in the late 1980s and continuing through the 1990s and 2000s, was driven by the revolution in precision weapons technology that the GPS satellite system enabled. When a conventional bomb can be guided to within meters of a target, the hardening calculus changes fundamentally. A facility that could survive the nearest miss achievable with unguided weapons in 1970 might not survive the direct hit achievable with guided weapons in 1990. The response was, again, depth. Going deeper meant that even a weapon that arrived exactly on target needed a longer penetrator to reach the critical facility, and penetrators had physical limits that no improvement in guidance could overcome. The fourth wave is happening now, driven by the convergence of threats that the modern strategic environment has produced. hypersonic weapons that compress warning times to minutes, cyber attacks on command and control infrastructure, EMP weapons that could disable surface electronics across continental areas, and the military programs of near-peer competitors who have studied American underground construction for decades and developed their own programs in response. China's underground military construction program is, by available evidence, among the most extensive in the world. The People's Liberation Army has built a network of tunnels, the underground Great Wall, in the phrase of some analysts, that by some estimates extends for thousands of kilometers through the mountain ranges of inland China, housing ballistic missile systems, command facilities, and logistical infrastructure that would survive even a massive, conventional or nuclear strike. The scale of this program, documented through satellite imagery, defector accounts, and the occasional official Chinese publication, has informed American strategic thinking about underground construction in ways that are reflected in the classified construction budgets of the past 2 decades. Russia's underground military program, the successor to the extensive Soviet-era construction, has continued through the post-Cold War period and has, in some respects, accelerated as the relationship between Russia and the West has deteriorated. The Soviet-era underground command network, built on an even larger scale than the American equivalent, has been maintained and in some areas extended. The strategic competition in underground construction is real, ongoing, and essentially invisible to the general public. It is a competition with enormous implications for the stability of deterrence, because the survivability of command authority affects the credibility of nuclear deterrence in ways that are not always appreciated. The tunnel network question. The question of what connects America's underground installations to one another is one that has occupied researchers for decades, and it is a question on which the gap between documented reality and informed speculation is particularly wide. What is certain is that major underground military installations do not exist in isolation. They are connected to the surface communications and power infrastructure through hardened pathways. They are connected to the National Command Authority through secure communications links of multiple types. They are, in some cases, physically connected to one another through tunnels that allow movement of personnel and equipment without surface exposure. The existence of tunnels between specific facilities has been acknowledged in some cases. The connection between the Pentagon and the alternate command center beneath it is known. The connection between the White House and certain continuity of government facilities in the Washington area has been reported by journalists with access to former personnel who worked in them. The specific tunnel infrastructure of the Greenbrier Congressional Shelter in West Virginia, built beneath the famous resort hotel, maintained secretly for 30 years, finally revealed by the Washington Post in 1992, included vehicular tunnels capable of moving large quantities of people and equipment. Beyond these specific documented instances, the possibility of a more extensive tunnel network, one connecting facilities across regions rather than within a single installation, is a question that the government has declined to answer and that researchers have been unable to resolve with publicly available information. The physics of deep tunneling make continental-scale tunnel networks of the kind, sometimes described in more speculative accounts, impractical with conventional TBM technology. A tunnel boring machine capable of creating a vehicular tunnel advances at perhaps 15 to 20 meters per day under favorable conditions. A tunnel connecting Washington to Denver, a distance of roughly 2,700 kilometers by air, would require approximately 370 years of continuous boring at that rate. Even a network of regional tunnels connecting major East Coast installations would take decades to complete. What is plausible, given the documented capabilities and the confirmed existence of major underground installations, is a more modest version of connectivity. Tunnel connections between facilities that are geographically close, hardened cable and fiber connections between facilities at greater distances, and the logistical infrastructure to support surface movement between installations under conditions of elevated alert. The strategic value of even limited tunnel connectivity is significant. Personnel who need to move between an underground command center and a hardened communications facility without surface exposure that could be observed by adversary satellites or compromised in other ways, benefit from even a short tunnel connection between the two facilities. The multiplication of these short connections into a regional network is not implausible, and the budget for classified construction over 70 years is sufficient to have funded it many times over. The tunnels are real. How extensive they are, how far they reach, and what they connect. These remain among the most carefully protected secrets of the American underground military complex. The intelligence underground. The intelligence dimension of the American underground military complex is one of its most sensitive and least discussed aspects. The facilities built for command continuity and strategic communications are not the only underground installations of strategic significance. The intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the various military intelligence services has its own underground infrastructure built for purposes that are distinct from military command but equally sensitive. The National Security Agency's primary facility at Fort Meade, Maryland, has underground components that house the most sensitive signals, intelligence processing equipment in the world. The specific depth and extent of these underground facilities has not been publicly disclosed, but the NSA's construction history, including major underground expansion projects in recent decades, and the known sensitivity of the equipment it operates, make some degree of underground construction both logical and expected. The CIA's headquarters at Langley, Virginia, similarly has underground components that have been described by former employees as extending several levels below the surface. The specifics are classified, but the general pattern, sensitive intelligence operations conducted in hardened underground spaces that provide both physical security and communications security, is consistent with the broader logic of underground construction. More intriguing and more speculative are the intelligence-related facilities that may exist at locations removed from the known intelligence headquarters. The operational requirements of intelligence collection, the need for facilities that can receive and process sensitive signals without those facilities being identified and targeted by adversaries, drive the same logic of secrecy and hardening that drives military command facilities, but with additional requirements for communication security that may make deep underground locations particularly attractive. The specific locations of classified intelligence processing facilities and the extent of their underground infrastructure are among the most closely held secrets in the American national security system. What can be said with confidence is that the logic of underground construction applies to intelligence operations at least as strongly as it applies to military command functions, and that the intelligence community has had both the budget and the organizational capability to pursue underground construction programs of its own, independent of and parallel to the military programs that have received more public attention. The intersection of these programs, the points at which military command infrastructure and intelligence infrastructure share facilities, share communications architecture, or share the physical underground space, is itself a sensitive operational detail whose specifics are protected. But the intersection exists. The underground empire of American national security is not a collection of isolated facilities. It is a network with connections and interdependencies that are designed into the architecture and maintained with the same operational rigor as the individual facilities themselves. Why they keep digging. The conversation about America's underground military complex almost always defaults to the past, to the Cold War origins, to the well-documented facilities of Raven Rock and Cheyenne Mountain, to the engineering achievements of the mid-20th century. This is understandable. Those are the parts of the story that have been partially declassified, partially reported, partially absorbed into the public record. They are the parts that can be discussed with some confidence about the underlying facts. The future of the underground military complex is considerably more speculative, and deliberately so. The specific directions that classified underground construction is taking in the 2020s. The new facilities being planned, the new technologies being applied, the new strategic considerations being addressed are not things the government discusses publicly. The budget lines exist, the construction contracts exist, the geological surveys and site assessments exist, but the specifics are protected in ways that make direct reporting impossible. What can be said with confidence is that the strategic drivers of underground construction have not diminished. They have, in the view of most informed observers, intensified. The development of hypersonic weapons by Russia and China has compressed the decision timelines available to American command authority in ways that make the hardening of command facilities more important, not less. When a hypersonic glide vehicle can traverse continental distances in minutes rather than the hours available from ballistic missiles during the Cold War, the margin for error in command survival is dramatically reduced. A command facility that takes 30 minutes to reach full operational status is useless if the warning time is 15 minutes. An underground facility that is continuously staffed and continuously operational, that does not need to be activated because it never deactivates, provides the decision-making continuity that compressed timelines require. The maturation of directed energy weapons adds another dimension. High-powered microwave and laser systems capable of damaging or destroying electronic equipment and optical sensors on aircraft and satellites are now operational in multiple countries. These weapons, unlike most conventional munitions, travel at the speed of light and are therefore essentially impossible to intercept. An underground facility, with its electronic systems protected by the natural shielding of surrounding rock, is substantially less vulnerable to directed energy attack than any surface installation. The alignment between underground protection and directed energy threat is not accidental. It is one of the strategic considerations that drives continued underground construction in the current period. The development of autonomous systems, drones, unmanned ground vehicles, robotic weapons platforms, creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities for underground military operations. An underground command facility that can control autonomous surface systems without exposing human operators to the risks of surface operation is a considerably more capable platform than one that must choose between command survival and operational effectiveness. The integration of autonomous systems into underground command architectures is an area of active development that sits at the intersection of artificial intelligence research, military robotics, and underground facility design. The space domain is also increasingly relevant to the underground question. Low Earth orbit has become a contested environment in ways that were not fully anticipated even a decade ago. Anti-satellite weapons capable of destroying or disrupting the satellite systems on which American military operations depend, GPS, communication satellites, intelligence collection platforms, have been demonstrated by Russia and China and are believed to be operational. An attack on American satellite infrastructure would degrade military operations across the board, but its effects on underground facilities would be somewhat different from its effects on surface operations. Underground facilities with hardened ground-based communications links would be less affected by satellite degradation than surface forces that depend on satellite communications for their primary connectivity. This relative advantage of the underground becomes more pronounced in an environment where the satellite architecture is contested. The energy security of the underground complex is another area of ongoing development. The diesel generators that serve as backup power for most existing facilities are dependent on fuel supply chains that are themselves vulnerable to disruption. In a prolonged conflict scenario, one in which surface logistics were severely degraded, the fuel supply for underground facilities would become a critical vulnerability. The development of compact nuclear power systems, advanced battery storage, and potentially other energy technologies creates the possibility of underground facilities with power independence measured in years rather than months, eliminating this vulnerability at the cost of the capital investment required to install alternative power systems. The environmental sustainability of underground operations, the management of heat, waste, water, and air over extended periods, is an area where commercial developments in sustainable building technology are increasingly relevant to military underground design. The techniques developed for long-duration enclosed environments in the context of space habitation research, Antarctic station operation, and advanced submarine design are finding their way into underground military facility design in ways that improve the habitability and operational endurance of these installations. The underground military base of 2040 will be a considerably more comfortable and sustainable environment than the installations of the Cold War era, which, whatever their strategic merits, were designed primarily for short-term survival rather than long-term habitability. Perhaps the most consequential development for the future of underground military construction is the maturation of tunnel boring technology itself. The machines that build the underground are themselves getting better. Larger cutter heads, more efficient rock removal systems, more sophisticated real-time monitoring of geological conditions, automated lining installation, All of these improvements are increasing the speed and reducing the cost of deep underground excavation. A facility that would have required 5 years to construct in the 1970s can now be built in 2. A depth that was considered impractical with 1980s technology is achievable with current equipment. This improvement in construction capability creates strategic options that did not previously exist. The ability to build deep underground facilities quickly, to respond to changing strategic circumstances with underground construction that can be completed in a time frame relevant to the situation, changes the calculus of what underground construction can accomplish. It is no longer solely a long-term strategic investment requiring decades of planning and construction. It is also an operational option, a tool that can be applied to specific strategic problems as they arise with a timeliness that previous construction technology could not provide. The underground empire of the United States is not static. It is a living system, growing and evolving in response to a strategic environment that is itself continuously changing. The facilities that will define American underground military capability in the middle of the 21st century are either under construction now or being planned. Their specifics are unknown. Their strategic logic is not. They are being built because the people responsible for American national security have concluded that the advantages of depth, protection against the weapons that adversaries have built, survivability for the command authority that makes deterrence credible, continuity of government function through the scenarios that planners most fear, are advantages worth paying for. The cost is significant. The alternative, in the judgment of those who have access to the full intelligence picture, is significantly worse. The underground keeps growing, the TBMs keep running, and the ground above them remains, to almost everyone walking on it, completely undisturbed. The democratic question. The secrecy that surrounds America's underground military complex is not, in most respects, legally or ethically unusual by the standards of national security classification. The facilities exist. Their existence is not denied in most cases. Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, and Mount Weather are acknowledged in official records and have been the subject of congressional oversight. The specific operational details, locations of classified facilities, communications architectures, personnel rosters, construction plans, are classified at levels that reflect genuine security concerns. Disclosure of those specifics would provide adversaries with targeting information and operational intelligence that could compromise the facility's protective function. This is the standard justification for national security classification, and in this specific case, it is largely valid. A hardened command facility whose location is precisely known to adversary targeting systems provides considerably less protection than one whose location is unknown. The relationship between secrecy and strategic value is direct and demonstrable. But the existence of a legitimate security rationale for classification does not resolve the broader question of democratic accountability. The underground military complex has been built, expanded, and operated for 70 years, largely outside the normal mechanisms of public oversight. The congressional committees that receive classified briefings on these programs are bound by the same classification requirements as the executive branch agencies that operate them. The public and the press, the primary accountability mechanisms in a democratic system, are by design excluded from the information required to evaluate whether the programs are necessary, whether they are cost-effective, and whether they reflect the values and priorities of the citizens who fund them. This is not a trivial concern. The underground military complex represents a commitment of resources, human, financial, and geological, that is literally irreversible in many respects. Tunnels that have been bored cannot be unbored. Granite that has been removed cannot be replaced. The decision to go underground is, to a degree that surface construction decisions are not, a permanent commitment to a specific strategic posture. Reversing that commitment, even if a future generation decided that the underground facilities were unnecessary or undesirable, would require decisions about facilities whose continued existence and operational status would still be classified. The problem is compounded by the self-reinforcing nature of classification culture. Programs that are classified tend to stay classified, not only because the original security justifications persist, but because the institutional interests of the agencies that operate classified programs favor continued classification. Declassification is work. It creates controversy. It exposes decisions made in the past to scrutiny that the institutions responsible for those decisions would prefer to avoid. The bureaucratic incentives run strongly in favor of maintaining classification, which means that the default trajectory for any classified program is to remain classified indefinitely, regardless of whether the original justification remains valid. The partial declassifications that have occurred, the acknowledgement of Cheyenne Mountain, the revelation of the Greenbrier facility, the CIA's acknowledgement of Area 51, have happened not primarily because the institutions responsible for these programs decided that openness was appropriate, but because outside pressure, journalism, congressional inquiry, the simple fact that certain facilities had become too widely known to continue denying, made continued denial untenable. The accountability that has occurred has been forced, not voluntary. This pattern is worth taking seriously as a template for what future accountability might look like. The underground military complex will not be voluntarily disclosed by the agencies that operate it. The pressure for greater transparency will need to come from outside those agencies, from journalists who have the patience and the skills to reconstruct classified programs from declassified fragments, from members of Congress willing to use their oversight authority aggressively, from researchers who apply the tools of academic investigation to national security programs that would prefer not to be investigated. The case for greater transparency is not primarily strategic. It is democratic. The citizens who fund the underground military complex through taxes that support a classified construction budget that they cannot examine, administered by agencies whose activities they cannot oversee, are being asked to trust that those funds are being spent wisely, in their interest, in ways that reflect their values. That trust is not unreasonable in a general sense. The American national security establishment has earned a degree of trust through its history and its performance. But trust without accountability is not a democratic relationship. It is something else. The underground empire exists. It is large, it is expensive, it is expanding, and it is largely invisible to the people it is built to protect. That invisibility is, in part, a design feature. It is also a problem. and it is a problem that the underground itself cannot solve, because the ground above it, however undisturbed it appears, is the ground that the rest of us walk on. The accountability for what lies beneath it belongs to the surface world. It belongs to us. Stand at the surface of Cheyenne Mountain today, and it is, on its face, unremarkable. A mountain, trees, the thin air of the Colorado high country, the wide sky of the American West. The visible entrance, a pair of blast doors set into the side of the mountain, connected to a road that leads through a security checkpoint, does not particularly suggest the scale of what lies behind it. Even knowing what is there, standing above it, you cannot feel it the way that knowing about it in the abstract makes you feel it. Going inside changes that. The scale of the main chamber, large enough to house 15 three-story buildings, lit by artificial light, humming with the sound of machinery that has been running continuously for 60 years, produces the same disorientation that archaeologists describe when they descend into the ancient mine passages at Great Orme, the sudden collapse of the distance between present and past, between knowledge and experience. The buildings are real. The springs they rest on are real, visible, enormous. The blast doors are real, and they are heavy in a way that blast door specifications on a page cannot communicate. This is what the underground offers that nothing on the surface can replicate. The experience of scale and commitment that changes the way you understand what has been built and why. The abstract strategic rationale for underground military construction, the need for command survival, the logic of deterrence, the requirements of continuity of government, become something different when you are standing in a space that was carved out of a mountain by human hands in response to a very specific fear. The fear was real. The threat that drove it was real. The engineering response was extraordinary, and it worked. Or rather, it has worked in the sense that the scenario it was designed to address has not occurred. Whether it has deterred that scenario, whether the underground architecture of American command survival has made nuclear war less likely by eliminating the first strike advantage that a decapitating attack would otherwise provide, is a question that counterfactual history cannot answer with certainty. But the logic is sound, and the people who built this infrastructure, who have maintained it for 7 decades and continue to expand it, are operating on that logic with the full conviction of professionals who have thought very carefully about what they are defending against. What lies beneath America is not, in the end, a mystery. It is a product. It is the physical output of decades of strategic thinking, political decision-making, engineering innovation, and human labor. Most of it invisible, most of it classified, most of it far better understood by the people who built it and maintain it than by the citizens it was built to protect. The story of America's subterranean military complex is, like the story of Britain's ancient mines, a story about what human beings do when they are serious, when the stakes are high enough, when the threat is real enough, when the commitment is deep enough. They go underground. They build in the dark. They accept the costs and the constraints of the underground environment because the alternative is unacceptable. The Neolithic miners of Grimes Graves went underground for flint. The Bronze Age miners of Great Orme went underground for copper that traveled through trade networks they may never have fully understood, to the civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean. The Cold War planners of Raven Rock and Cheyenne Mountain went underground for command survival, for the preservation of the capacity to govern and defend a country in the aftermath of the most destructive weapons ever created. The impulse is the same, the stakes are different, and the underground is still being built. The TBMs are running somewhere below the surface of the United States right now. The vibration they produce, if you are near enough, if you are attentive enough, feels like the heartbeat of something very large and very serious, something that has been building for 70 years and has no intention of stopping. The surface, as it turns out, is not where the most consequential things happen. It never has been. What lies at the bottom changes everything. And the bottom, as it always has, goes deeper than anyone expected.